Good afternoon. Um, as you see, our panelists, they have all enthusiastically agreed to use this panel to dive into the future of IP, to be our wise sages in predicting what the fates may hold for IP. According to WIPO's Global Innovation Index 2023, literally released last week, groundbreaking technological progress continues, fueled in great part by a digital innovation wave, AI, supercomputing, and automation. Many of the key indicators of technological progress are trending positively. Computing power continues to increase, green supercomputing is becoming more efficient, renewable energy is increasingly affordable. Top corporate R&D expenditure exceeded $1 trillion for the first time, with ICT firms the primary drivers and contributors. That said, on the other side of the coin, low economic growth rates, high inflation, and the after effects of the COVID-19 pandemic are putting brakes on innovation, and the socioeconomic impact on IP has stalled. At the same time, at WIPO, we see that the global awareness of the potential impact of IP as an economic tool is increasing steadily. WIPO Pulse, published for the first time last month, is a groundbreaking new survey of awareness of and attitudes towards IP rights. It is based on 25,000 interviews from 50 countries, and it provides a very unique snapshot of how individuals, communities think and feel about IP. WIPO Pulse reveals that in all regions, including the Global South, the positive impact of IP on the economy is recognized and understood, with IP seen as a key tool for ensuring fair income for individual innovators, creators, authors, and designers. While respondents in all regions recognize the positive impact of IP on the economy, this feeling is strongest in Asia Pacific, Africa, and Latin America and the Caribbean. In each case, more than 2/3 of respondents have a favorable view of IP's impact, higher than in Europe and in North America. However, the survey also highlights that many lack the necessary understanding of IP. So what does this all mean for the future of IP in an interconnected world? Personally, I was hired by WIPO almost 4 years ago to look after a new area, then called AI and IP policy. At the time, I had been working as a patent litigator for almost 20 years, and I was heading the global IP team at the third largest generic pharmaceutical company in the world. When I was invited to WIPO to discuss the potential role, let me be embarrassingly honest, I remember saying to the then Director General that I had no clue about AI and IP. As Dan mentioned yesterday, AI is not a new technology. It has been bubbling around for decades. 2 AI winters, and it really did not look like it was going anywhere fast. On the IP policy side, the discussions are certainly not new either. Some of you may really be surprised to hear that WIPO held a first worldwide symposium on AI and IP in Stanford in 1991. The discussions were fairly expert, and dare I even say IP geeky. In 2019, WIPO convened the first conversation on AI and IP, which attracted just under 100 participants in person in Geneva. 4 years later, ChatGPT arrived on the scene. Within 3 months of its release in November 2022, ChatGPT had surpassed 100 million active users and catapulted generative AI into the spotlight of public debate. The latest version, released in March this year, is said to have 1 trillion parameters. The average human brain has about 86 billion neurons. It was trained on around 300 billion words, including web pages, books, and other sources. Let me remind you, the average human vocabulary ranges from around 20,000 to 35,000 words. The latest WIPO conversation on IP and generative AI in September attracted more than 5,000 participants from 168 countries, causing an unprecedented buzz in IP around the world. What does this have to do with interconnectivity in our panel? Interconnectivity, interconnected devices, digitalization, and ultimately the data generated as a result is one of the main drivers of this AI boom. In fact, interconnectivity, the Internet of Things, and data are driving a whole wave of what I like to call frontier technologies. The computer-brain interface, quantum computing, the metaverse, digital twins, human augmentation, and much more. Data and all of these technology and digital assets are often multi-contributor based on collaborative innovation efforts, global supply chains, and crossing borders freely. Rightly or wrongly, all of this is making it feel like the tectonic plates of IP are shifting and shifting fast. Now, is it truly a King Arthur-worthy round table of patent knights you will be hearing from? Before we set off, I would just like to remind the knights and speakers of the rules of jousting. We want to keep this panel conversation style without any opening statements, and I would also like to ask our knights or speakers to limit their answers to no more than 2 minutes, and I will now give them fair warning that I will be charming by firm about enforcing that rule.
Exactly.
With that in mind, let me begin with a starter question. Our session is entitled The Future of Intellectual Property in Interconnected World. I would like to ask our panel, one by one, what is their understanding of an interconnected world, and what, if anything, is different in an interconnected world that particularly impacts IP? And I'll go to Dan first.
So the first thing I would say is that the world has been increasingly connected for hundreds of years. And the drama that I think that we see today is not just that there are interconnected mechanisms where humans can more readily communicate with one another, but there are also interconnected devices that facilitate both communication by humans with one another, but also with the devices themselves. And in the end, the big question is, what is the end point? What are we really after? It is humans, at least up to this point, that are enabling, creating, innovating, and enabling these devices, presumably to create a better world. Mm-hmm. And yet, what we know, and in many of these forums, particularly, I think I've been to all of these, Bo, correct me if I'm wrong, for the last 22 years. But in each of these instances, there's so much of these conferences that really come back to patents. But in this interconnected world, for the first time, we are suddenly seeing that the structures of IP, including copyright and patents and trade secrets and trademarks, are all going to be interplayed in terms of how this is managed so that the interconnectedness actually has benefit as opposed to tragedy. Mm-hmm. And we're weighing those things every single day.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dan. And maybe going to Michael, because really at Meta, I would imagine that interconnectivity with what you're doing, both on the content side and on the innovation side, really merges. So what's your take on the question?
Yeah, so first, on this amazing panel, I'm happy to say that I'm probably the Galahad of the group of this round table. And 20 years means you've been attending these since you were a teenager. So very nice.
You're absolutely right.
Very nice.
Prodigy, in fact. Right?
Exactly. So the question is, what is my thought on an interconnected world? I work for Meta, formerly Facebook, and this is where everybody goes, oh. But our mission is to connect people. Mm-hmm. And that connected world is not just in WhatsApp which sits in your phone and allow you to connect with individuals all across the globe. But to your point, Dan, the world has become increasingly more connected as we've created things like social media, but before then, the telephone, of course, the internet. Ericsson has been long a producer of the ability for us to communicate globally. So Meta is no stranger to that. And that interconnected world is important because for me, speaking to my family in Jamaica, the United States, I just sent a message that broadcast through my home for my son to finish his breakfast. Because undoubtedly at 8 o'clock, he hasn't done it yet. It's just his MO. These are the advantages of that connected world from our perspective. And at Meta, we're building, of course, the social networking apps that you all hopefully use, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. I'm okay if you don't use TikTok. But also the metaverse and what it means to connect with individuals in the new 4IR, if you will, or the fourth in an innovative revolution. So I think it's something that we have been experiencing for hundreds of years and will continue to do. We just have to make sure that intellectual property matches the ability for us to do that in a controlled and thoughtful environment.
And let me ask you follow up with that. Is there anything about the interconnectivity that you think impacts IP specifically, or something that changes how we should look at the IP system?
Yeah, and we'll delve deep into that in this panel, but I think we can all appreciate that as you think about taking things from the physical into the virtual realm, intellectual property will follow. But the law itself is something that tends to lag behind. So our practitioners are constantly thinking about how to apply to the digital realm, including to the metaverse and beyond.
Thank you so much. I mean, I will probably follow up with another question because it flows quite nicely. I mean, you said in the interconnected world, in the digital world, IP, digital asset IP, will follow into the digital world. And it's very often said that in a digital world with immaterial assets, IP will increasingly be more and more important. And I would imagine that all of us in this room have some confirmation bias. We all know about IP and we would sign up for that statement to be true. However, there are other voices that worry that IP was designed for a world of economic scarcity for physical assets, and that in a world where digital assets can be replicated at zero marginal cost, where it's just zeros and ones, a world that is moving incredibly fast and flows across borders, IP matters less and less. Nigel, what's your take?
So it's true, but I sort of pick up from Dan's comments that this transformation isn't yesterday and today. It's an evolution through the second, third, and now the fourth industrial revolution. So we've been, for those of us who are old enough, which is frankly most of us in the room, we've taken on this challenge before. But there's a great book by Jonathan Haskell, who's on the Bank of England Monetary Committee, called Capitalism Without Capital, where he studies the economic impact of physical to intangibles, and whatever the statistics are, that 80% of economic value sits in the intangible world now. So it's true, and to Mike's point, which I'm sure we'll develop further, you know, the law needs to always catch up. And for those people in the room and outside the room, whether in economics, business or finance, we should all be brave, because unless industry, to Andre's point, unless industry takes the lead, if we sit there waiting for law and regulators, then we'll be very disappointed.
Thank you, Nigel. Mickey, going to you. How do you understand the internet-connected world, and what's the impact on IP?
Yeah, so a few different things, and perhaps a slight different take than regarding the timing of this. Yes, we are more and more interconnected. I totally agree. But there is a statistic I think is rather shocking, which is more data has been created in the last 2 years than there has been from the beginning of time 2 years ago. So the sheer volume of data is unprecedented. And so I even though, yes, it's been an evolution, it's an exponential evolution. You combine that with processing powers, processing speeds that we have today, especially in our GPUs, we're able to make AI insights like we'd never had before. hence ChatGPT, right? So I think, you know, it's a very different world now in light of that sheer volume of data. I think the underlying technologies, you know, the connectivity technologies, 4G, 5G, Wi-Fi, video standards, and so on, will be addressed by platforms, tools, and can get addressed that way. But I think more importantly is, like, what about all the data that's being created from it? Who has that data? How fragmented is that data? Who can make the insights from that data? That is where I think the real challenge is going to be. And you're starting to see some copyright lawsuits, maybe half a dozen of them now, in the ChatGPT space around, you know, copyrighted works being fed into these models and people recognizing the underlying copyright rights that are associated with that. You're seeing Adobe and Microsoft and some others actually take on some indemnification with respect to that. So I think we're just at the beginning of the cusp of that. But I think there's a real big question on what is really the right that we're talking about in this data, who has it, and who has the ability to make the insights from it.
Thank you for
And doesn't it also assume that the data is somehow a measure of innovation? And I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. So if you look back to the first industrial revolution and the second and the third, each one of them for the society in which it was occurring were at least equally shocking. You know, if you were to bring somebody from the you know, late 18th century where astounding innovations were even occurring from the first industrial revolution, and to suddenly see aircraft taking off and landing constantly and going overhead and all of the things that go on, let alone pulling a smartphone out and expecting it. For society in each of these eras, there was enormous shock, awe about what was occurring. And that's what we're seeing here. But for humans that went through it, it was at least as astounding. And the one thing that I think we all have to bear in mind, because I always hear this thing of, you know, the law will catch up. But if you think about a patent system, which really originated at latest in the mid-17th century, and some arguments earlier than that, it has been shockingly stable. And the attempts that have been made, for example, in the U.S., the Mask Acts that went on as a sui generis kind of protection, it was a terrible failure. Almost no one ever used it. It did nothing at all. So what I would say is that the intellectual property regimes that the world has adopted to, the TRIPS agreement, I lived through that, and therefore it was a hard-fought battle for a decade. That there isn't the kind of radical change that needs to happen. It's always adapted. It's going to continue to adapt. And I believe with very little tweaking, the more tweaking you do, the worse it's likely to become.
And that raises a very interesting question. Going back to the buzz on AI and IP that we're seeing at the moment. Clearly, there is a lot of feeling that AI is somehow different for IP, that the IP system might need a little bit of help to adjust to. There are different views on that. I mean, what's your take? Is there something fundamentally different about AI as a technology, the fourth industrial revolution, or is it much of the same and it will adapt? Really with the background that what is often said is that the IP system was designed to foster human innovation and creation, and suddenly you have a machine element in all of that. And I'll give that back to you, Dan. Is there anything specifically different about AI? Also because it impacts all IP rights, not just one.
Look, it's another transformational technology that was created by humans as a tool, right, to do stuff more rapidly than what they could do for themselves. Is it different? Yes. But does it need a fundamentally different piece of coverage? Is there something that has to be altered? You know, an example is I believe that this presents a very interesting question about for copyright law much more than it does for patent law. And this is going to be decided sooner than later, where you have creators, usually of artwork or literature or something else, who are saying you shouldn't have the right to use my stuff to teach a machine to replace that which is based on my creation. So this gets very intricately into big debates over expression versus, all the elements of good copyright law. I think courts will have to render those kinds of decisions, but it's still using the same basic framework that we have right now. It's just how is it going to apply, not that we're going to change it to apply. And so I'm very guarded about overreaching too fast, because that usually means a bad mistake is about to be made, especially when governments are doing it.
I'm sure Andre would
and I
agree
would-
to that.
I would have
But I was
gone-
going to open it. And anyone wants to add?
Only because
Disagree?
I would normally just go and say I agree with everything Dan says, but on this one,
That would be no fun. So please.
I've gone through a slight change of view, and in particular in relation to copyright. I was with NVIDIA last week, and Ian Cunningham, who's the IP General Counsel there, a very thoughtful guy who's given a lecture on copyright and large language models. And I thought I had this sorted. Don't mess. The courts will, industry will sort it out. Courts will follow. But he talks about all the cases. He tracks it all the way back to the US Constitution, but he then picks up pace and gets to the camera and goes through all the case law around that. And that must have been frightening, right? You just point something and you capture it. Would there be copyright in the mechanical output? Answer, yes. Oh, we're all good, right? We sail through another 100 years. And then the courts now take a look at the output from large language models and say, no. So now we have vast quantities of what, to me, imagining what the result would be, original output, having no modicum of human intervention, and the answer is no copyright. So I understand all the case law in relation to what Mickey was referring to. What about the inputs, right? Do people have their rights trodden over to create the large language models? But I think as soon as you end up with vast quantities of output that are not going to get what I thought would be obvious layer of copyright protection, I think that is going to pose a monumental challenge. And I don't know whether a tweak in the law or don't mess at all is going to sort it
But
out.
doesn't that presuppose, again, that the output wouldn't be found to be infringing all of those copyrights, in which case it's a infringing piece of work.
Right.
And whoever created it is now liable
Right.
for the infringement.
So just to infringe Ian Cunningham's copyright, he predicts, and I think I will go along with this prediction, so I predict that will be decided in favor of the rights holder, rights will be suppressed. Because anything other than that will kill off large language models.
I think that
stone
would be a
dead,
terrible
and
mistake, so
that
I
would
hope
be
you're
terrible.
wrong.
Yeah. You think it's a terrible mistake to ride roughshod over the import rights?
over the copyright owners. Absolutely.
And then just one quick follow-up question: just what then happens to LLMs?
That they will have to figure out something that's in the public domain that will allow them to train.
I think when it's so easy for copyrighted materials to be accessed, it will happen. It will run roughshod over it. Look what happened to the music industry. We had entire devices where there was one cassette on one part of it and a second cassette where the sole purpose is to copy from one to the other. There was no respect for copyright with respect to that because the technology was just too easy to emulate. So I think that'll happen here too, where it's just too easy to be able to garner.
So are you saying then, but if you can run roughshod over the creator, the innovator of music and literature and art, then what prevents someone from also running roughshod over the innovator, over the innovations that are patented?
Nothing. It's happening now.
Right. I disagree with you. I don't believe that the patent system is fundamentally jeopardized. I think that, as Andre pointed out, there are things that governments, certain governments in particular, but really all governments are doing in an attempt to weaken patent rights. But I can tell you that patent rights are alive and well, since our company has spent $4.5 billion acquiring rights just to get people out of disputes.
Well, that's yeah. I'm not saying it's completely said, but
Right.
but a company can use those what's patented. It is up to the other to enforce, and it will take years and years to do that. There may or may not be success. There's lots of patent quality issues, right? All of those issues that we're all well aware of come into play. It doesn't prevent someone from using that technology.
Let me come in there to follow up. I mean, there's an input and output question when it comes to ChatGPT, and I don't want to take away from the panel that's falling after us, but AI clearly excites people's views. And it goes back, Dan, to your point that really what is new is that it impacts across different IP rights. It's not just patents, it's copyright, it's trademark. And I find large language models very interesting because we think of generative AI and the word of it generates content, it generates pictures, it generates video, and then you're in the world of copyright. But really that is not all, and by far not all, large language models are doing. Large language models are used on the innovation space, on the technology space. I'll give you an example. There is a technology that I believe is developed by NIH of analyzing sound samples, and they believe that they can detect throat cancer 3 years before it shows up on scans on minute changes of the voice. Suddenly you're in a world where you have copyright protected potentially input, but the thing that's coming out is not a competing work. The thing that's coming out is a technological innovation, showing that in some ways the IP rights are merging. Do you think that would warrant different treatment?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
I feel like I'm sort of dominating this conversation, which I don't
I'll
want
give it to
do.
the others in a second.
Yeah. The answer, again, I would like to understand better what the technology is. But if what you're saying is that there's technology that using a large language model or some other form of generative analysis can detect a voice, changes in a voice, in order to diagnose a disease, look, is it patentable? That is it novel in the layman's language, novel, useful, and non-obvious? If the answer to all three of those things is yes, then it should be patentable and receive the same treatment that any other invention that is novel, useful, and non-obvious receives. Period.
But on the input side, because you're clearly using potentially copyright material in order to train the large language model, should that be treated the same as a generative AI model that comes up with pictures?
Again, I would have to understand precisely what it was. In other words,
Such a lawyer's answer. It depends.
Yeah, but it depends. So is it taking, for example, copyrighted music, and is it trying to diagnose Madonna as to whether she has throat cancer, because you can analyze her voice over decades, and suddenly the voice has changed? That's very different than if you have people who are volunteers and you have millions of people who give their voices, and then you figure out how many of them had throat cancer subsequently. I don't know the answer, but generally I still abide by. I believe that the fundamental regime is intact. It will go through interpretation by the courts, as it always has, but the fundamental regime is intact to deal with what we think is this monstrously different set of technologies, which 100 years from now won't be deemed to be all that monstrously different than anything else.
Thank you. And Michael, maybe if I can come to you, because I mean, Meta really operates in the middle of all of this legal uncertainty, I would imagine. How do you navigate the legal IP risk while the courts are coming out with answers?
So it depends.
I will tie them down to an answer in the end.
I mean, look, I think when we think about generative AI, and I have this conversation constantly, we obviously have a team of lawyers who are focused on the implications, thinking strategically about, really being thoughtful about the inputs, the training models, and really thinking through a lot of the issues that we're seeing within the landscape. But we're all going through the landscape together. But I actually agree. It's not something that should cause alarm. I mean, I recall very specifically one day, after spending hours in the library, my mother came home and with the scraps that she had, decided to call up Encyclopedia Britannica. And she knew that that day she was going to make an investment into a compilation of the largest information A through Z that one could ever possess under a singular roof. And she ordered it, and she couldn't afford the gold embossed leather one. We got the paper thin one, but it's okay. It arrived, and we built a bookshelf to it. And I would open up C, and I would look at cat, and I would research maybe. And then teachers would similarly stop students who copied verbatim out of H. And this is plagiarism. You cannot copy this. This does not belong here. And then years later, I went on this thing. And I went on the internet. And besides the fact that it took up her line and it was busy, I didn't need the Britannica anymore.
Yep.
And she was completely floored by this concept that I would go on the internet and from there generate information at the couple keystrokes, inputs, derive information that I would then use as research for my paper. And then we didn't have online blue booking. We do now. It's something that evolves. And so putting a prompt into ChatGPT, certainly there could be novelty maybe to the prompt. There's a lot of things that have to be sorted out. But in a model that you create, that you train, and that you derive, should you give rights to just the input and whatever comes out from the learning model, or should there be work that's put in? For example, I don't think anybody would agree, and this is no surprise, Bo doesn't own the copyrights to the poems he just made. Unless you change them, now we're starting to talk.
Exactly.
Right? So I think everybody, I line on the side, and I'm not representing the company in this regard. I think it's still up for debate. But on a personal level, I do think that we should be very cautious to just jump and change the laws because we think this is a scary thing.
And do
In
you
my youth, I got my information from scrolls. that
There you
were
go.
Put on papyrus.
I'm telling you.
Exactly.
And then you would share the scrolls with your classmate and get in
Exactly.
trouble
That's
for
exactly
cheating.
right.
But that's an interesting point because from scrolls to the lexicon you were talking about was very many years, hundreds of years, thousands of years, from the scrolls to from the encyclopedia to the internet going.
Yeah, exactly.
Was less amount of years. From
Yes.
then to where we are is even less amount of time. So is there something intrinsically in the speed of technological development caused by data and by interconnectivity? Because I don't think the courts have sped up exactly on the same time scale as technology has. Maybe I'll start with Nigel at the other end.
And I think it's, again, it's a continuum and it's a shift in responsibility for those people who have had the privilege of advising the world's innovators for 30 years. They don't stand still. The human nature is to innovate. And that is not going to stop. It probably wouldn't stop whether the patent law was abolished because innovation is part of the human condition. And so all the businesses in the room, including, of course, Meta, who's got metaverse at the heart of its name, will continue to innovate. And it's our responsibility to move quickly because we know that if courts and regulators have struggled with the internet as they did, with tape to tape, as they did, they're sure as hell going to struggle with everything that's going on. So we, the community who have that confidence that it will all be okay in the end, and if it's not okay, it's not the end. Just support them. And I'm a huge fan of contracts, collaboration, consortium, agreement, platforms to actually solve problems that can't be solved by regulation.
Are they
But I do
platforms or
think
pools?
I'm very confused.
But I do think, also business models evolve in light of the ease of technology, right? So I'll go back to the music model. $17 CDs were unacceptable and copying was rampant, and then went to songs being purchased to streaming, right? The business models around music completely changed to make it much easier for people to legitimately pay for that. So I think we'll see some of these things and these types of changes in business model. I think the question becomes on, as particularly on AI, is I go back to who owns the data, right? The access to that data is the most important piece, not the algorithm. If you're following the Google antitrust trial that's going on right now, you're seeing that same set of issues. Can a company compete in the search space without access to all of that data? And if a company like Microsoft can't compete against a Google, what is a small company going to be able to do in that situation? So I think the real question there is, Meta has the social data, Amazon has the shopping data, Google has the search data. Is that going to be democratized, or will it be privatized by these very large companies?
Which I guess the question then becomes, what role, if any, does IP have to play in regulating data? Michael?
I think intellectual property is at the heart of it. I mean, let's begin with the concept of IP, intellectual property, that which the mind can conceive. That's at the core of what we do. How we do it has changed over time. And we've already touched on the music industry. The copyright industry has continued to change. The patent industry had continued to adapt to the formats that are created, right? We saw the same issue, of course, with time shifts, the ability to record content. Now everything's on demand. So it catches up. Will it be readily the same? No. I mean, I recall when FedEx Kinko, their case, students were able to copy textbooks at the copy machines, and that had to be decided, whether that was a permissive use, even if it was an excerpt of a textbook. So when we think about intellectual property, we at Meta obviously take a considered approach to making sure that we protect that which is ours. But there's so many different factors, and this has been stated before. It's not just patents. I think that is a big part of it. Thinking about the inputs, the facts itself, if it meets the levels of patentability, achieving a patent for that. Of course, trade secrets have become more and more important when you think about proper protection of these large language models, or how to utilize the algorithms or output, of these models. But then, of course, copyright. All of these are big factors in how you think about protecting in this next phase. We were talking about this very same concept just 2 years ago with intellectual property and blockchain.
Yeah. I mean, I think Mike brings up a really good point with respect to trade secrets in particular, that we're seeing in these large companies in particular, patenting is decreasing and trade secret protection is increasing, right? Which means now that information isn't being shared. So you don't necessarily have the Westinghouse out innovating the Edison as much anymore if it is being privatized.
Ulrike, I want to offer a slightly different version of your question,
Sure.
which is, your question, I believe, was, what role does intellectual property play in, your word was, regulating, right?
Data.
And data. And what I would prefer to say is, what role does it play in protecting and creating and properly exploiting data, as opposed to regulate, because regulate implies government intervention in my view, and that should always be the last resort.
Right.
And if that is actually what happens, it is an admission of industry's failure, of the private sector's failure to do what it should do. So, clearly, I've said what I have to say about the role of intellectual property in creating innovation. I couldn't agree more with Andre's excellent presentation. Is without intellectual property, innovation wouldn't occur. And it's not because people wouldn't innovate, it's because nobody would provide them with the money that they need to actually create much of anything.
But I mean, that raises a real question for me, because we have some IP nights sitting here, we have sophisticated companies sitting here. We're at Ericsson. We're all very familiar with the world of technology, and we're all very familiar with the world of IP. Now, what I see is that IP, and what I hear, is getting more complicated in this interconnected world because more IP rights matter. There's uncertainty. You have to do a mesh. Also, the technologies are getting more complicated because how many people, we all use ChatGPT, who can honestly say they're machine learned enough to understand how large language models work? And really, when I then think on the ground up of small, medium-sized enterprises, individual creators and innovators, I mean, what would your, and I'll go around the table starting with Nigel, what would your advice be for the SMEs, the startups, the small innovators and creators, how to navigate the interconnected world in IP?
Can I just go backwards one step just to the data question? Because it was just going around my head that we sort of made a really big assumption. The data we were talking about, that Mickey was talking about, the exponential growth, how much has been created in the last 2 years. We made the assumption, whether it was protection or regulation, that it was intellectual property. And over the last 3 years, I've seen a very significant and to be welcomed development inside major companies, that in the olden days, when a new challenge came along, they used to give it to the IP teams. I used to be an IP lawyer for a couple of decades, and it was like, oh, data protection came out. Oh, well, give that to the IP team. Encryption definitely sounds a bit technical. We'll give that to the IP team. Data, oh, well, that sounds a bit like it might be an intangible. Give it to the IP team. And I think that's where it must stop. And inside companies, I'm now seeing cross-functional groups being set up where data is a business asset. Clearly, it is a business asset, but so was IP, and that wasn't always understood by the business. So I just wanted to make the encouragement for those people who are being encouraged to take ownership of regulation, licensing, and storage of data, then there should be some pushback to ensure that it's spread across the business. Now, very quickly, because I'm conscious of the time rule, the last question was, what encouragement would you give to SMEs, how to go and face that? Well, of course, Cypher, for the last 10 years was an SME. We were 41 employees. We were set up in 2013, going to the community and going, the end of Boolean, let's use machine learning to map patterns to technologies. And but for the fact I'm Jewish, I might as well have been the Antichrist. I mean, it was a difficult conversation. So I don't think the SMEs need to be worried about. The SMEs in many parts of the world are where the innovation is tried, tested, not always successfully, but the SMEs account in the world for a very significant part of the innovation, and nothing will stop them.
Anyone else?
I always encourage small, medium-sized enterprises to create, and until they're really quite wealthy, no one's going after them anyway, right? And once they're really wealthy, they'll have the ability to take care of paying the innovators that they may have unintentionally stepped upon their innovation.
In the patent side, I completely agree, but copyright does bring in statutory damages associated with it that can add up rather quickly. Again, the company has to be big enough of a target for that to be addressed, but it raises a different issue.
Which then brings me to a question where we've talked a lot about what this interconnected world means for IP. What can the interconnected world do for IP with small, medium-sized enterprises? So what is your take of what interconnectivity data can actually do to make IP more accessible in order to become that tool to drive innovation? Nigel?
Well, I'm stealing Bo's 20-year-old thunder. I mean, it's education. I'm still amazed that we sit here having the discussion going, how do we ensure that the whole business community understands the importance of the assets? I mean, Andre's talk lands exceptionally well because it was a an excellent presentation to this community. We understand that strong rights are, but I would encourage Andre to go on a roadshow to business schools, engineering schools. We all must take that responsibility to put out the message. Unless there's a deep understanding of the importance of protection of intangible assets, then I think we're going to struggle, and I think we need to do more to educate.
Going around the circle, Michael. Oh, sorry, not the circle, Mickey.
I agree with Nigel's comments. I think it's, I think having this volume of data out there, as long as there's, sort of access to it, can really accelerate innovation. And sort of your medical example. And there's so many pockets of fields where that can be the case. I do think the fragmentation of that data and the inaccessibility of it is a technical problem that needs to be resolved. But the more that's great is more accessible, then more SMEs can participate and really innovate.
Thank you, Dan.
Well, I mean, isn't the whole purpose of being interconnected to make ideas and data available to almost anyone? It's much easier to get a broader piece of data off from the internet than it was out of Encyclopedia Britannica. And so I think that this is a wonderful time to be a small or medium-sized enterprise. They have access to huge amounts of data. Yes, they have to tread through the maze of making sure that they're legally using whatever it is that they're obtaining. But what an unbelievable ability to exploit ideas and inventions and copyrighted materials. The expression is not copyrighted. Sorry, the expression's copyrighted, but the idea certainly is not. And so it's a treasure trove, I think, it's a great time to be an SME.
And I mean, Michael, for creators, the metaverse that you're creating for individual creators, is that going to be a new world with better income streams, with more direct connection between the creators on one side and the content users on the other side?
I think that we're already seeing that now. I think that education, is key. The same way we all spent a fair amount of time with our older generation explaining the concept of a smartphone and how to connect with each other and how to talk. And no, Mom, that's not how to use that emoji. Eggplants are for a very specific You have to take that same approach with large language models, generative AI notwithstanding. Meta has its own large language model that is available. Llama 2 has a limited commercial license. And we think very thoughtfully to allow individuals to be able to build their businesses based on this premise. We're seeing it every day. Not every company is going to survive simply because there's a lot of competition, but that's the process. We want to create innovation. We want companies to say, hey, I can actually use this large language model to create X, where someone has not thought about that before. And they can then further train a particular model and then launch a platform, a system to create innovations for the broader community. And that's not changing anytime soon. The metaverse, as you think about it, is one metaverse. It's not Meta's verse. Might be kind of cool if you were a rapper. But the metaverse is effectively the internet. We go to the internet, one thing, and we may visit various sites within the internet. The metaverse is conceptually the same. You join the metaverse and you may be able to access Meta's space within the metaverse or any other companies or innovative systems, but people can create there too. And just because we've created the ecosystem and on-ramp through, for example, our virtual reality or mixed reality headsets or glasses or whatever your medium may be, it's creating innovation for the broader community, for anybody who wants to embrace it, to take advantage of it. And I think that's the way innovation has always worked, even if the IP protections may shift and change to accommodate that space.
By the way, your suggestion and description of the eggplant, if for any of your companies make mobile phones, can you please have a feature that disables the speaker function for people over 80 years old?
Yeah.
Especially if you raise it to your ear.
What? What?
But before I open it for the last 5 minutes to the floor for any questions that you might have, I have a very selfish question. And that is, in the WIPO conversation, the work that we do at WIPO, we try and connect the regulators and the policymakers on one side much more closely with the innovators and creators on the ground, because certainly in the WIPO conversation, the feeling is the closer we move these worlds, the closer we have the gap between any regulation or any shifts in the future. So what message would you like me to bring along with me from this discussion round?
Well, if I haven't been clear on it already,
We know
no, I
that.
don't think I have to
Don't
repeat
do
that.
anything.
Right, exactly.
Nigel.
I yield my time on that question.
Okay. Mickey.
But it was a sort of a positive rather than a negative reminder, wasn't it, Dan? I mean, the message to the regulators is listen, because you need to follow, you are following because the innovation is coming from there and you are watching it from an international perspective. So yeah, get close. Just don't be tempted to act too quickly.
Just following up, just again, self-interest. How do we close the gap? How do we get better at connecting the industry, the enterprises to regulators?
Yeah, well, I was going to actually address the last one, but perhaps it addresses both. But if we go back to mid 2020, and the pandemic's upon us, and cities, towns, communities, states, countries are trying to report on data on terms of quantities of cases and vaccine rates and such, and how difficult it was to get clear data around that. And I think it really highlighted at a government level, like, again, back to my fragmentation point, it was so fragmented that we couldn't make heads or tails of that data, and it became sort of front and center and obvious to everyone how difficult that was. So I think I've read a stats that something like only 2% of data is actually accessible because of that level. So I think from a regulator standpoint, having data in a way that can be manipulated so it can be used would be a huge benefit.
I mean, one of the things I said earlier, that if governments have to act, it's a failure of industry to act. And part of the problem that all governments have worldwide is they hear from pieces of industry, but until industry effectively, at least in large part, agrees on what should be done, government isn't going to know what to do. And so they want to listen. And the only time that I can think of that this has occurred in the intellectual property arena in the last 30 years is industry in Asia, at least in Japan, in Europe, and in the US came together, where the CEOs of every conceivable kind of industry in the US ordered their companies to put a representative into a group that was formed specifically to get a coherent message around the TRIPS negotiations. And that was done, and that group teamed up with UNICE in Europe at that time and the Keidanren in Japan, which between those three controlled a huge amount of industry worldwide. That is not happening. It hasn't happened since then. It took an enormous amount of effort. And the problem for government, not to criticize it, is that they're getting such differing messages from so many different industries where there isn't agreement that they simply don't know what to do. And if they don't know what to do and feel that they have to do something, more than likely they'll come up with a solution that isn't going to be good.
Which should encourage more conversation.
It should encourage more conversation, exactly.
Which is exactly my point.
Yeah.
Have the conversation. I think that Meta and many other companies are very invested in educating around the space. And if we have more conversations surrounding the intellectual property, I think we can come to better resolutions that are better for humanity, which is the goal.
Yes. Well said.
Very good. I'll open it to the floor. Anyone, any questions for our fantastic nights?
Hello?
Yes, we can.
So, very interesting. I just wanted to say that pre-COVID, there was a move by a number of Asian patent offices to put forward the need for new protections for data. Now, post-COVID and in the AI world, that's going to be accelerating. So in spite of Dan's "don't fix it if it's not broke" comment, I do think that, depending on which side of the argument you're on, you're the data holder or you're the one who uses the data, you may have different perspectives. So how would you sort of see threading this needle on potentially new IP protections for data?
Look, I don't think that I'm advocating in a position that something's not broken. I think there's lots of things that can be broken. There always are, there will be, have been in the past. What I'm advocating is that the structures, the architecture of the intellectual property regime, I think can deal with almost every piece of change. You fix the things that are broken through the existing structures, as opposed to fundamentally re-architecting what the structures are.
So you would not be in favor of a new protection. You think the existing protections are sufficient?
I think between the structures of intellectual property protection, there is the ability to fix these things, as opposed to developing a sui generis, some kind of new regime to protect data. There's always been data. The existing regimes can handle it. Let's just figure out what the problem is and use the existing regimes to fix it.
And as a quick postscript to that, Europe tried, UK tried with sui generis database rights. No help at all.
Yeah, doesn't work. On that happy note.
No? Are we allowed one more minute, Bo? Okay, there is a gentleman back there.
Is it on? Yeah. Eric Olsson, Sandvik. Specifically talking about innovation and the role of IP and patents in particular for developing innovation. I think we agree that LLMs and ChatGPT, as an example, has been a good innovation. Do you think that patents has played a relevant role in that development? Or would it happen regardless of patents?
Well, certainly incidentally, they have played an important role because it's dependent upon all kinds of semiconductors and speeds and processors and communications networks and everything else, all of which have been patented. So had none of those things been patented, then we wouldn't be in an environment where ChatGPT-4 or 5 or 6 or 10 or 50 would be possible. So yes, I would say patent regime has been very important.
As we say at Meta, I double-clicked that.
And on that note, shall we double-click on this round?
That's right. Is it cocktail time?
Well, for us it is, so we're off.
Well, it's
I'm not
always
sure for
cocktail
the rest
time
of them.
somewhere.
Where's my
I
can of
just have to do
PBR?
some interview for Bo next. So